This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up, Connecticut state senators have a bill before them to authorize bear hunting. Do the numbers of black bears in the state warrant a hunting season? We'll find out from state environmental officials and hear why some residents oppose the idea. Now, have you seen a black bear in your backyard? Were you afraid or curious? We want to hear from you, too. You can join the conversation today, 860-275-7266. Email wherewelive@wnpr.org. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Now, today, Where We Live, we wanted to learn more about black bears and help answer your questions. We invited Dr. Ben Kilham onto the show. He spent a long time studying black bears near his New Hampshire home. Dr. Kilham is called the bear whisperer by some, the bear man by others. He's the author of several books, including In the Company of Bears, What Black Bears Have Taught Me About Intelligence and Intuition. He joins us today from the studios of Vermont Public Radio in Norwich, Vermont. Dr. Kilham, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You've made a career studying bears. I understand for 20 years you've acted as a surrogate to orphan black bears, and you've been able to observe their habits, their interactions, their biology. How did that all begin for you?
Well, I grew up with my father, Lawrence Kilham, who was a professor of virology at the Dartmouth Medical School and studied birds as an avocation. So I grew up in a household with lots of wild animals around. When I was 2, my dad went on sabbatical to Africa and brought a half-grown leopard into the house, much to my mother's chagrin. My younger sister, Phoebe, who helps me with the bears today, was 1 at the time, and my next oldest brother, Josh, was 4, and he woke up one night with a leopard at the end of his bed. But needless to say, we all survived and returned from Africa with 2 African hornbills and a Nile crocodile that my dad raised in a basement shower until it was 6 feet long, and the National Zoo came and picked it up. In 1961, we came to New Hampshire, and my dad continued his studies with birds, primarily birds, but we had porcupines and red fox and woodchucks and all kinds of native wildlife. My dad wrote a book on the life histories of the woodpeckers of the eastern United States, as well as a book on crows and ravens. So it's pretty much the way I grew up. Mm-hmm. And when my time came along, I was interested in carnivores. And at the time, there was no formal rehabilitation of bears. I was interested in perhaps a coyote or a bobcat or maybe a fisher, the large woodland weasel we have around here. And my plan was to, because of my experience with orphan animals, I knew I could walk orphan animals loose in the forest and they'd follow me, and I could observe their juvenile behaviors and use them to understand adult behaviors. But it turned out it was black bears that came to me, and black bears were the ideal animal to study in this fashion.
You said You said black bears came to you, so you were rehabilitating other wild animals?
We were rehabilitating other animals, and their conservation officer brought us an 11-month-old black bear cub that he thought had been hit by a car. And it turned out it had not been hit by a car. It had no infectious disease, but it had the shakes and couldn't climb or stay on a branch. And that animal was quickly confiscated from me, but later that spring, the director of Fish and Wildlife in New Hampshire called me up and asked me to take the bear back. And we kept it and observed it until eventually it had to be euthanized, and we sent its brain out to the Wildlife Disease Lab in Wyoming and got a diagnosis of lysosomal storage disease, which is like Tay-Sachs in humans and caused by inbreeding. This was interesting. It was the first documented case, and since then there have been 2 more cases in New Hampshire, 2 in Massachusetts, 1 in Maine, and more recently 1 in Wyoming. And it's likely caused by the fact that in the 1850s, 85% of New England was open agricultural land. The forest habitat of the black bear was greatly diminished and fragmented, so it led to isolated populations of black bears where this type of inbreeding might have occurred.
Hmm. You first wrote your book in 2013. At that time, you did not have your PhD. In fact, you've been very open about having dyslexia and how that at one point stopped you from pursuing advanced degrees. But how did having dyslexia impact the way that you interacted with these bears, the observations that you made over the last couple of decades?
Well, one of the advantages of dyslexia is that we have other skills, and the skill to make very precise observations. I think in pictures, so I could go for a walk with my cubs, and I'd pay attention to anything that stuck out, and I would come back, and I wouldn't take any field notes on the walk, which is distracting. And then I'd sit down and rewalk my walk. A video would play in my head, and I could see in precise detail what took place during the walk. So I could be very descriptive and very accurate with my observations.
So you've been taking care of how many cubs to date now through the years?
We're over 150 black bear cubs have been brought up by us and released to the wild.
Now, is that considered unconventional, this idea that you're helping raise these cubs, but then releasing them back into the wild? Are these bears, in fact, still wild because they've gotten used to you?
Well, the cubs come in all different stages. Some of them are very young. Before they have left the den with their mother, they have no experience outside the den. We had 2 cubs arrive this morning where somebody had shot the mother. These cubs are now 5 months old. They're going to be very, very wild on coming in because of their experience, traumatic experience of losing their mother in that fashion. But we have some bottle-fed cubs, which will quickly mix with them. Our experience is that bears want to be bears, and if they're exposed to the natural environment, that's what they'll do. We have done enough cubs now, and with all different age groups. The most difficult, obviously, are the bottle-fed cubs. The ones that have more experience with the mother are much easier. But experience tells us that it's successful. And the Fish and Game departments of Vermont, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts wouldn't still be sending cubs to us if there was any problem with the work that we do.
One of those cubs that you helped years ago was Squirty. Tell us about this particular bear.
Well, Squirty came to me when she weighed 3 pounds and was 7 weeks old. Her eyes had just opened. I raised her by walking her in the forest and documenting her behavior, giving her an opportunity to learn and giving myself an opportunity to learn as well. I put a radio collar on her and tracked her as she became an adult, a subadult, and then an adult, and moved into the forest. Squirty established her own home range, and as she expanded that home range, she would drop a daughter into the expanded area to hold the expanded area. Squirty now shares her home range with many adult daughters and granddaughters in what I call a greater home range. And she manages that home range with a matrilinear hierarchy, where Squirty is the matriarch and on sight will chase any of her daughters that she meets in her home range. And it's a matrilinear hierarchy because the number 2 female chases all the females below her, the number 3 female chases all the females below her, and the last female, who is generally a subadult, gets chased by all the adult females. And this ensures that in a marginal food year that at least one of these females will have access to enough food to reproduce. But it does a second thing. It creates space for these females that don't have their own home range to survive and stay within this matriarchal home range. And because of the pressure, normally they would have, if they had an open home range, they would give birth at age 3. These females may not give birth until they're 4, 5, 6, or in even one case, even 7 years old. And their opportunity will be based on a natural food supply. An abundant crop of acorns or beech nuts will allow them that opportunity to reproduce.
This is Where We Live. We're speaking with Dr. Benjamin Kilham today, a wildlife biologist, author of the book In the Company of Bears, What Black Bears Have Taught Me About Intelligence and Intuition. He joins us today from the studios of Vermont Public Radio in Norwich, Vermont. Now, Ben, the reason we're talking with you today, so often this time of year, people are seeing bears in their backyards. There's a debate going on in Connecticut whether there should be hunting. We'll talk about that a little bit later. You've observed and learned so much through the work that you've done. What is something that you've learned that pushes back against what typical scientists think about black bears?
Well, when I started working with black bears, and I'm working very closely with them, black bears were considered to be solitary animals. That is, the only interactions they had with their own kind was with their cubs and their mates during the mating season. They knew they gathered at concentrated food sources, but beyond that, they knew very little about them. And what I found is that black bears are actually highly social animals, but they're not social in the manner that we typically think of a pack of wolves or a group of chimpanzees that have fixed territories and family units that live within those territories, alpha animals that regulate the resources down through the family group. Black bears are more social the way that humans are. I found that the females are reciprocal altruists. They form friendships with unrelated females. Because of their food supply is unevenly distributed on the landscape, and their home ranges are evenly distributed on the landscape, it creates situations where one female may have a huge surplus of food in her home range, like a big acorn crop, and the neighboring female may have nothing. And in the next year, the neighboring female may have a huge crop of beech nuts, and the bear with the acorns would have nothing. So they form relationships so they can share each other's resources on a year-to-year basis. They remember these females. They remember the fact that they are not aggressive towards them, and they actually welcome them into each other's home range. And I found that the amount of aggression that Squirty shows towards the unrelated females, and there's a group of unrelated females that are all related to a bear that did Squirty a favor when she was a cub, she shows very little aggression towards them, yet she chases her family members on sight. And there's a huge parallel between this and human behavior, because if we think about it, we're much harsher on our family members than we are on strangers. And the reason we're harsh on our family members is because they're our closest cooperators. And we can react any way we wish, and we can often react harshly and get away with it because we can always reconcile with a family member. But strangers are also cooperators, and we never act harshly towards a stranger because we might not be able to reconcile. And so this same pattern of behavior exists in both black bears and humans.
Do you think Squirty sees you as a member of her family?
Squirty definitely sees me as a member of her family, and because I raised her, she treats me like a bear. Unfortunately, she's dominant over me. She's still the matriarch. I'm number 2. And I'm dominant over all the other bears, all of her family members, and the unrelated females that come in to her home range. They're all intimidated by me. But because I raised Squirty, she's not intimidated by me, and I have to obey her rules. She judges and punishes based on a set of rules, which she also manages her female relatives with. And as soon as I learn the rules, I don't have to deal with any punishment by her. But with Squirty, a punishment is a bite, and with her relatives, she chases them. They're fast enough, they're young, they're lighter, they can run faster and then climb and get further out on a limb than Squirty can get. So they rarely get bit. But as a human, I can't run. So I have to be careful around her. Her rules are very simple. Basically, if she's interacting with another bear in a social encounter, I'm not to interfere, and I've learned that the hard way. But you only have to get bit once to understand what rules are.
So you've been bitten by Squirty?
I've been bitten by her. They're punishment bites. She bites and then goes right into a reconciliation moan, making up to it, saying basically, that was necessary, and I'm terribly sorry.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Dr. Ben Kilham is actually talking with us from the studios of Vermont Public Radio, a wildlife biologist, author of the book In the Company of Bears, What Black Bears Have Taught Me About Intelligence and Intuition. He spent more than 2 decades observing bears, also serving as a surrogate mother for orphan bear cubs that he has then reintroduced back into the wild. Now, after the break, we're going to find out more about black bears in Connecticut with state wildlife biologist Paul Rigo. Have you seen bears in your backyard? Join the conversation. That's coming up. This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today we're talking about black bears. By now they've emerged from hibernation. Their breeding season begins in late June and July, early July, according to the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. Now, officials at the state agency say the black bear population is growing in Connecticut. Does that mean lawmakers should allow bear hunting? We'll find out coming up later in the show. Now, to help us learn more about black bears, today from the studios of Vermont Public Radio, biologist and author Dr. Ben Kilham is here. He's studied bears for years in the woods of New Hampshire near his home. He's taken care of orphan cubs, released them back into the wild. He talks about his experiences and what he's learned in the book In the Company of Bears, What Black Bears Have Taught Me About Intelligence and Intuition. Now, you too can join the conversation. The number 860-275-7266. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. I wanted to ask you, Dr. Kilham, should humans be fearful of the bears they may see walking through their backyard?
Humans don't need to be fearful, and they actually are safer around bears if they're not. The people that get in trouble panic and often run and show weakness. If you want to get along with a bear, if you have a close encounter, and they rarely happen, you want to stand your ground, stay dominant, keep your eyes on the bear, and talk softly to it. Bears understand our emotional communication, our facial expressions, the intonation of our voice. They won't understand our words, but they'll understand body language and all other aspects of communication. Unfortunately, we think bears are from Mars. We don't understand their bluff charges, the way they chomp their teeth. I've spent an awful lot of time in my book and in the films that I've done talking about how bears communicate. The more people know about how bears communicate, the easier time they will have when they have a close encounter with them.
Now, we've heard from listeners and just people that I know, if they have a dog and sometimes there's that interaction, what do you do then if your dog is out in the yard and a bear happens to be nearby, especially this time of year if there are cubs near the mother?
Well, the biggest thing is not to have food attractants in your yard so you don't have those kind of interactions. Bears belong in the forest. They're very secretive animals. They don't come out unless they're food attractants. And if people are regularly having bears in their yard, they're doing something wrong. They either have bird feeders or uncontrolled garbage, or their dog food is stored on an airy porch where bears can smell it, or their neighbors are doing something wrong. The bears naturally are secretive. They have no interest in humans, but they have a lot of interest in human foods. And bears get friendly quicker than any other animal, and it's based on their social behavior, this business of reciprocal altruism. A bear thinks highly of somebody who feeds them, and they quickly form social contracts. So if somebody has a bear come to their bird feeder and they continue to put their bird feeder out, that bear will develop expectations that food will be available to them on a regular basis. And that escalates into a bear breaking into homes when the food is not there. Bears will punish people for not living up to the terms of a contract. So it's terribly important that if a bear comes to your house, that you clean up all the food and you make it so there's nothing that attracts bears to the property. And if a bear is on the way to a neighbor's food, make sure the neighbor cleans up. These are relatively serious things, and it's the human rarely gets punished. And I'm a great believer that humans should, on every occasion that a state officer has to reply to a bear complaint, that the human gets fined because it's the human that's causing the attraction. Should be a nominal fine, like $20 a parking ticket. Nobody likes to get a parking ticket. And that would have a big impact on these bear-human conflicts. But unfortunately now the bear gets punished, and the bear either gets removed or it gets euthanized for its behavior.
Joining the conversation in studio with me now is Paul Rigo, a wildlife biologist at the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. Paul, welcome to Where We Live.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here.
I wanted to get a snapshot of the bear population in Connecticut. What are we seeing? What are you and other officials seeing within the state?
Okay. First, I'd like to say good morning, Ben. Met you many years ago up in the New Hampshire or Vermont area. So good to hear your voice.
I remember that.
Yeah. So in Connecticut, we have a rapidly growing bear population. One of our indices of the population is just the sightings from the public that we receive, and we've been tracking that for 3 decades, and it's been just growing almost exponentially. If you go back 3 decades ago, bear sightings were quite rare, perhaps 100 reported sightings a year. If you go back 1 decade, we were at about 2,000 sighting reports per year. This last year, we almost got to 7,000 sighting reports. That's not 7,000 bears, but sighting reports. And in Connecticut, we have a very high human population, about, I would say, 5 times denser population of humans than New Hampshire, and a very rapidly growing bear population. So we see lots of interaction between humans and bears. In fact, I think we receive more conflict reports in our state with a population of bears that's probably 1/10 or maybe 1/5 the size of New Hampshire's bear population.
So you're saying that there have been, I think I'm looking at the website earlier today, in the last year there have been 6,400 bear sightings in the state of Connecticut. That does not mean there are that many bears, but how many bears are in Connecticut? Yeah. What's the estimate?
Right now, our estimate is in the neighborhood of 700. It's a difficult process to get a real accurate population estimate, but we've done it 2 ways. One study conducted at the University of Connecticut that actually finished 2 years ago, and both studies agreed that we're in the neighborhood of 700 bears, although that estimate is a couple of years old, so no doubt we have more bears now.
Now, at one point, there were a lot of bears, pre-colonial times. Then they were hunted, and then the bears left. Tell us a little bit about that history and what's making the comeback.
Well, Ben touched on that, and that's a pattern that occurred throughout New England. Pre-colonial times, New England was largely forested, which is the best bear habitat. As our part of the country was settled, there was great removal of forest, land clearing, largely for agriculture, but for other purposes such as charcoal production. And so that removed bear habitat. In Connecticut, it's thought that we dwindled down to only about 20% forest habitat, down from nearly 100%. So removal of habitat was one big thing. The other thing, as you called it hunting. I like to call it unregulated exploitation, because bears were not viewed in a good light. A lot of people were farmers, and bears represented a threat to their crops and their livestock. And bears were not seen in a good light. And if there was an opportunity to kill a bear, they were killed. So there was no protection of bears prior to the 1900s. And so those 2 forces in Connecticut led to the complete extermination of bears from the state.
And they're coming back. Why now?
Well, those 2 factors have been reversed. There was unregulated exploitation. Now bears are protected. In most states in their range, there is hunting allowed, but it's regulated, so it's kept at a level that hopefully maintains the bear population, or other goals depending on the state. Some states might hope to reduce their population a bit or grow it a bit. But then the other big factor is the regrowth of forest. As the Industrial Revolution came along, people no longer had to make their living as farmers, especially in this part of the country where there's so many rocks in the soil, and moved to the cities. A lot of the cleared land reverted back to forest and became suitable habitat for bears once again.
We heard Ben Kilham describing earlier why bears come on to a person's property because of food sources. Is that a problem where people are still putting out their bird feeders in Connecticut at this time of year when they shouldn't? You mentioned with farming, nowadays more people have backyard chickens and they have beehives now. Is that all encouraging these bears that we see in Avon, Simsbury, Farmington, these big numbers?
Right. Well, yes, and the case with every state that has a bear population is we have great efforts to get the information out to remove attractants around one's home. So yes, putting bird feeders out, not storing your garbage properly, can easily lead to bear visits in your yard or in your neighborhood. Backyard chickens have become very popular in recent years, and we're seeing very many cases of bears attracted to backyard chicken coops, maybe to the chicken feed itself, but also killing chickens. One challenge we have in Connecticut is we have such a strong interspersion between forest and developed areas, residential areas. I think even if we were somehow able to get people to completely remove food attractants in their yards, we would still have backyard visits by bears, because bear habitat and residential areas are more or less one and the same in a lot of our towns. I also have to empathize with some of our town residents who've lived in downtown centers that have, the classical residential areas, the downtown where kids ride their bikes and people walk on the sidewalks. And for years and years and years, these have been areas where they haven't had to worry too much about wild animals. But now that forest has regrown and bumps right up against residential areas, people that live in downtown Avon, Farmington, Simsbury, places where most people would walk around and say, well, this isn't the wild, this isn't bear habitat, but those people are experiencing bears in their yards.
This is Where We Live. You're hearing Paul Rigo. He's a wildlife biologist with the State Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. Also with the conversation today is Dr. Ben Kilham. He's also a wildlife biologist. He is the author of several books, including In the Company of Bears, What Black Bears Have Taught Me About Intelligence and Intuition. He's joining us today from the studios of Vermont Public Radio in Norwich, Vermont. You can join the conversation, too. Have you seen bears in your backyard? Do you have questions for our guests in studio? The number 860-275-7266. I wanted to take a call. Derek is calling from Branford. Derek, you're on the show.
Hi, I'm very happy to be on this show. Thank you for taking my call. So it was just a quick little anecdote I wanted to provide, and it's funny, I heard one of your guests mention Avon so many times. I went to boarding school a couple of years ago in Avon, Connecticut, and the school sits on about 1,000 acres in Avon, densely wooded, and bear sightings were very, very common for us, whether it was walking around in the woods. We have a pond that we would venture to on the weekends and after class, and even on campus. They would just kind of saunter through the quad or the village green, and it was very casual. It was really kind of much ado about nothing. We didn't go grab a gun or bear mace or have a fence up like some of our legislative people feel the need to have. But it was really wonderful to see them out and about. And obviously, we just stayed behind closed doors, let them kind of run their path, and then off they went. And it was really just a really great thrill to see these great animals. And I hope as citizens of Connecticut, we don't want to go the route of Californians with the grizzly bears. I really hope that these rising populations are good for everybody, and we can all kind of live together as man and beast.
Well, Derek, thank you so much for your call and your comment about some of your bear interactions through the years. You can join the conversation, 860-275-7266. We got a tweet from a listener who writes that he sees bears all the time. He loves seeing them, but he doesn't report these sightings anymore for fear of euthanasia by the State Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. Paul Rigo, what would you say to him?
Well, first off, we're well aware that probably the vast majority of bear sightings are not reported to us. But we hope that year to year, the same proportion or percentage are reported, so that makes it a valid index of the population. We are a management agency. We do have responsibility for dealing with certain levels of conflict, certain types of conflict. And we do have a policy, as most states do, where there is public safety concern, that it's prudent and the responsible thing to at times remove bears from the population that show threatening behavior or do threatening behavior. We're like most states in doing that. We have had bears that have showed aggressive behavior, and we just cannot take the chance of just moving that bear to another town. All our towns are inhabited by humans. So it's part of our responsibility. It's not something we take lightly. And also, one should put that in perspective, too. As I mentioned just a little while ago, we receive approximately 7,000 bear reports per year at this time. A lot of people actually would like us to get rid of bears, and a lot of people love them. But if you consider that we have over 7,000 reports per year, we receive approximately 1,000 reports of conflicts per year, yet actually taking the action to euthanize a bear, that happens maybe once or twice a year. So we're not out there trying to solve every problem by killing bears. And in fact, we're putting a lot of effort into educating the public to prevent these problems in the first place.
So when someone sees a bear, the state would like you to report if you see a bear, but you're saying that it doesn't mean that the state's going to come out and relocate that bear or, in some cases, euthanize a bear.
Right, yeah. Actually, we very rarely relocate a bear. About the only time we relocate a bear is if it has wandered very deep into highly unsuitable habitat, so into an urban area such as Hartford. We have removed several bears out of Hartford that have wandered deep into the city and got stuck. In most cases, if we deal with a bear, we do attempt a technique called aversive conditioning, trying to give a bear a negative experience at the site where it's been a conflict, and hope that changes the bear behavior. And at the same time, it's a lesson for the human residents about changing their behavior too.
What do you think of Ben Kilham's proposal that if there are nuisance bears coming on property time and time again, maybe it's time for the human to be fined? What do you think about that, Paul?
Well, I have some agreement with that. We've actually tried to get legislation to allow us to fine people that feed bears after they've been warned not to. And we've had several instances, maybe one or two occurring right now, where people are overtly feeding bears, and it's really a disservice to the bears. It's a disservice to their neighbors, and just leads to worse and worse bear behavior. And in extreme cases, it could lead to a very serious public safety threat, and the unfortunate need to remove the bear from the population.
I want to take some more listener calls. Again, we're talking about bears today. Dr. Ben Kilham joins us from the studios of VPR in Norwich. And John's calling from Simsbury. John, you're on the show.
Hi. Thanks for taking my call. I have a question about bear behavior. Last week, just a few days ago, I had a bear bedding down in the woods behind my house. My yard is pretty deep. It's about 100 feet back to those woods, and this bear was about 50 feet into it, which I became aware of because my dog was going crazy. And that didn't seem to bother the bear. It would just, when I discovered it, which I think was probably 2 hours into its being back there, I was spreading mulch on my lawn this whole time on my beds. But when I became aware of it, it lifted its head as if to say, would you shut that dog up so I can go back to sleep? Then I kept checking on it. This was around noon, and I kept checking on it until sundown, until last light, and it was still back there. It seemed like odd behavior. A friend suggested that maybe it was recently out of hibernation and still groggy, but that seemed kind of late in early May. So what do you think?
All right. Thank you, John from Simsbury. Dr. Kilham, how would you answer that question?
Well, that kind of behavior kind of suggests she might have had young cubs up the tree that he failed to observe. the females will lay at the base of trees for long periods of time until they feel it's safe for their cubs to move, and she might have been waiting until dark for that to happen.
Anne's calling from New Milford. Anne, you're on the show.
Hi. So to say, the Lakeville Journal often ran a little piece at the bottom of their front page about local wildlife sightings, and many, I recommend people go back and look at them. But the one that I'm thinking of was a man went to the downtown, like the type of downtown your guest was talking about, a small town, and he went at 11 o'clock at night to the ATM, and he turned around to go back to his car, and there was a bear between him and the car. And it's just that, it reminds you that you might like a bear very much from outside your window or from inside your house, as it passes through. But it's a little bit different when it's between you and your car. And I think there's, a lot of people had, even Lakeville had other stories like that over the years. Also, I refer to something in New Milford where a man didn't control his dog and let it out to scare the bear away, and ended up shooting the bear because he said the bear was threatening his dog, and it turned out there were cubs up the tree, which the Connecticut people did allow to go on. They tagged them and let them out, and anyway, I don't know whatever happened to those twin cubs, but anyway, so that's all. I just said Lakeville Journal, great source of local wildlife.
Well, thank you very much. So, Dr. Kilham, I'm curious, if the cubs were let to go on their way, what would happen to them without their mother?
Well, it depends on their age. If it was late in the fall and they were already fat, they'd do very well. There's a point about dogs. It's usually the aggressive dog that makes a bear retaliate. Bears have very little interest in dogs unless they've been bit. And the behavior of sicking your dog on a bear in your yard is not a very good choice. And if you let your dog out and you've got a bird feeder and the dog incidentally comes in contact with the bear, don't rescue your dog. The dog and the bear can work out the details. I had a situation in New Hampshire where a woman called me and said her dog had just been mauled by a bear, and then she finished the story and said, I opened the door and the dog ran into the house and it didn't have a mark on it. The bear had soft-pawed the dog. She says, then I looked out above my bird feeder and there was 2 tiny cubs above the bird feeder. Well, obviously the bird feeder was the end of the story, and clearly the reason the bear was there in the first place. But that bear the dog wasn't aggressive towards the bear, and the bear just did not use claws or teeth on the dog. So every encounter is not a bad one, but aggressive dogs that bite bears will create bears that retaliate.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. That's Dr. Ben Kilham, a wildlife biologist, author of In the Company of Bears, What Black Bears Have Taught Me About Intelligence and Intuition. In studio, Paul Rigo, wildlife biologist with the State Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. Coming up, we'll take your calls, including should lawmakers approve a bill here in Connecticut to allow bear hunting? 860-275-7266.
Digging up insects from an old tree stump. Been too long since you were plump. With 2 little cubs wrestling around, climbing up a branch, then falling down. Climbing up a branch, then falling.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today we're talking about black bears. You may see them in your backyard. Is it time for Connecticut to allow these bears to be hunted? To talk about that, we're joined on the phone by Rick Jacobson, Wildlife Director for the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. Rick, welcome to the show.
Hi, glad to join you.
So there's a bill before the General Assembly. Tell us what the bill would do if approved this session.
Well, in its current form, it would establish a process through which we would adopt regulations that would provide for a bear hunt.
And how often has this been before the General Assembly? Is this something that may happen this session?
Well, it was. There was a bill introduced in the Environment Committee, and the Environment Committee did consider it, took public comment, debated the bill, and took a vote on that bill. And ultimately, the Environment Committee did vote to forward as a joint favorable substitute bill that bill out of committee. So my understanding is, at present, that bill is eligible for being brought forward and debated in the Senate.
And from the DEEP standpoint, is it necessary to have a law on the books to allow bear hunting at this time?
Such a bill, should it become a statute, does provide one more tool to us to be able to manage this growing bear population in the state. So in that regard, it would be a valuable tool to have available to us. If and when we would actually take advantage of that tool, it would depend upon a whole host of factors, including public engagement.
And if this were to become a law, it wouldn't be open season on all bears. There would be set limits in place?
Yeah, well, first of all, we have to see what final bill comes out of the legislature, should they choose to pass it, and then that will be the foundation on which we'll structure any regulations. At the moment, we don't have a specific plan in place because, again, it's dependent upon what the final statute looks like. So I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Well, we know when this is brought up in the past, there are opponents to something like this if it were to become a law. Annie Hornish is joining us now, Connecticut Senior State Director of the Humane Society of the United States. Annie, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So again, before lawmakers, a bill that could allow bear hunting in the state. Why is your organization opposed to that?
Well, we feel that we should be protecting our black bears, not hunting them for trophies. This is a trophy hunting proposal, and it's ostensibly in response to an increase in human-bear conflicts. But there are 10 science supports not having a hunt. There's 10 recent scientific studies that show that trophy hunting does nothing to stop human-bear conflicts. And the reason's obvious to most people. Hunters usually hunt deep in the woods, and they're removing non-problem bears from the population, not the ones that are rummaging through neighborhood garbage cans. So there are simple common sense measures to reduce conflicts if and when they occur. And this was already stated earlier, but most of it involves public education to teach people how to remove what's attracting the bears. And that's oftentimes and usually accessible garbage. Or things like pet food left outside, or bird feeders, or barbecue grills that are not cleaned. You know, people aren't intentionally, by and large, they're not intentionally feeding bears in their backyards. It's mostly this unintentional feeding that's behind virtually all human-bear conflicts. And the remedy is public education.
I'll let Rick Jacobson respond to what you said about this measure is about trophy hunting. How would you respond to that, Rick?
Well, I'm not exactly sure what people mean when they say this is a trophy hunt. Most people that I'm aware of that bear hunt do it very similarly to how they might pursue deer hunting, for instance, where it's a source of wholesome, low-fat, antibiotic-free protein source that's locally sourced that they use for their families. So in that regard, it's not that much different than deer hunting.
I wanted to go back to one of the experts we have today, Ben Kilham, a wildlife biologist, author of In the Company of Bears, What Black Bears Have Taught Me About Intelligence and Intuition. You live in New Hampshire. New Hampshire allows bear hunting. Ben, what's an effective way to manage the bear population if, again, it is growing, as state officials say, here in Connecticut?
Well, I think it's correct that bear hunting is a tool. It's also in a state that hasn't had it before. It will be very controversial without any question. In New Hampshire, bear hunting has been allowed for a long time. The bear population has grown despite bear hunting. Our habitat is in good shape, and we can handle a lot of bears. The bears population is managed by a social carrying capacity, surveys of people getting responses of how many bears they'll tolerate rather than a biological carrying capacity. And the biological carrying capacity could handle a lot more bears than we have in New Hampshire. Connecticut has a much greater social problem. I mean, the density of humans on the landscape is far greater, that interface between bears and people. So it's really the it is a tool, and I don't expect the state of Connecticut would be radical in how they remove bears. Their population is not that high. It wouldn't sustain a removal of a great number of bears before it might be in decline. So.
Well, I want to thank Rick Jacobson from the State Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, also Annie Hornish, Connecticut Senior State Director for the Humane Society of the U.S., for giving their thoughts, different perspective, again, on a bill. It's not a law yet here in Connecticut that could allow bear hunting, black bear hunting, in the near future. I wanted to take another call. John's calling from Hartford. John, you're on the show.
Oh, hi. I just have a comment, or actually a comment regarding the situation that happened last weekend. I was out on the woods at Sleeping Giant State Park, just behind Quinnipiac University. And if you don't know, it's a fairly heavily traveled park with a lot of trails just behind the university. And I was up there with my wife, and I noticed that there was an inordinate amount of what I thought were bear markings on the trees. And I'd never seen that many bear markings on this heavily traveled trail, and I was wondering if the professors could comment on why they thought there would be. I could be wrong. They may not have been bear markings, but it sure looked like bear markings on the trees, and there was just an inordinate number of them in this heavily traveled area.
All right, John, thank you for that question. I'll let Paul Rigo, who works for the state, also a wildlife biologist, answer that question about Sleeping Giant, a very popular park in Hampton.
Well, first off, that's an area of the state where bears are not quite too common yet. Bears do mark trees, and Ben could probably talk about this too, that they will reach up and essentially just take a big bite out of the bark of a tree almost as high as they can reach. The male bears typically do this. Tends not to be highly concentrated where they do that. So I do wonder if it truly was all bear markings, because usually they don't appear in real dense clusters of markings like that. So I guess it's just remains a question mark there if it was true bear markings or not.
I wanted to go back to, again, Bill Kilham joining us from VPR Studios in Norwich, Vermont. You are the author of this book, In the Company of Bears, What Black Bears Have Taught Me About Intelligence and Intuition. You say that bears are very social. What can humans learn from bears, Ben?
Well, there's a lot that we can learn from bears about ourselves. Bears operate on very primitive behaviors, which we operate on as well, but we're unaware of. And I've often said that if we were aware of our primitive beginnings, we might use our head better in managing the problems that we have, because a lot of our responses and our emotional responses to problems come from those primitive beginnings.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us today, again, from VPR Studios in Norwich, Ben Kilham. Thanks again, Ben.
Thank you for having me.
And I wanted to just read a tweet from a listener who writes, we should promote the black bear as a tourist attraction, similar to what Connecticut does with bald eagles. I'll let Paul Rigo, the Connecticut wildlife biologist, take that one.
Well, we don't have the good bear viewing areas like Alaska has, where the bears concentrate at salmon streams. Yeah, it is part of the outdoor experience, and we do mean to perpetuate the population of bears in the state. We don't want to completely eradicate bears from the state. We want them to be here for future generations to potentially get a glimpse of, but hopefully not in your garage or breaking into your home. So, bears are here. They're in our northwest woods, and hopefully people that go out hiking maybe get a glimpse of one, and it makes their day.
Well, thank you again, Paul Rigo from the State Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. Today's show was produced by Jeff Tyson. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Thanks for listening.